Okay, so thank you for tuning in today. Today we are going to be talking about The Outline of Sanity by G.K. Chesterton, who is one of the leading voices in the concept of distributism, which is a uh, predominantly Christian economic system, mostly based on the writings of Chesterton. Also, some writers like Hilaire Belloc, and then also influenced by uh, the Rerum Novarum, right, written by I believe it was Pope Leo. I don't want to commit to that, but one of the popes, right? We read Rerum Novarum a while ago, so you guys are probably somewhat familiar with that. Some initial thoughts. We're just talking about the first two chapters today, which is about half the book. Um, but as far as my opinions on Chesterton, I would say his writing is quite good, and I think he has a very good tone. He's good at translating ideas in a pretty humorous and insightful way, right? I think he's a fan of using parables and pretty interesting analogies in that sense, which is quite good writing. And I think this is the type of book you could show most people, and they would be receptive to it, right? It's not uh, totally off-putting in the sense of most far-right kind of literature, and to the point where I wouldn't even consider this far right except for the fact that it's Catholic. Right? Anything Catholic these days is pretty much uh, the absolute worst thing you could be today, right? Um, but yeah, so just off of that, I think this is the kind of book that I would recommend for anybody, trying to get somebody um, uh, critiquing both capitalism and communism, right? And it's a little bit more accessible than even something like Spengler, I would say, right? A lot of what he says is not too much different than Prussianism and socialism, right? But who's going to read an 80-page essay called Prussianism and Socialism by some German pre-Nazi guy? um, I would say you're much more you're going to get a lot better reception with this Catholic writer who's pretty insightful and humorous. Um, so on that note, I would just like to analyze a couple passages and what I think really capture the gist of what he's saying. I'd say in these first two chapters, he doesn't really get into what exactly distributism is. He talks more about a very mild critique of capitalism. Well, I don't want to say mild critique; it's a pretty scathing critique, but it's mild in the sense of it's extremely accessible, and it's not so off-putting as your radical communist or socialist kind of critique of capitalism, where they kind of they jump the gun a little bit. But I think these are very good criticisms. So I'll bring up a passage that Casius actually posted that I definitely want to talk about. So reading it here is: capitalism is contradictory as soon as it is complete, because it is dealing with the mass of men in two opposite ways at once. When most men are wage earners, it is more and more difficult for most men to be customers. For the capitalist is always trying to cut down what his servant demands, and in doing so is cutting down what his customer can spend. As soon as his business is in any difficulties, as at present in the coal business, he tries to reduce what he has to spend on wages, and in doing so reduces what others have to spend on coal. He is wanting the same man to be rich and poor at the same time. And Casius made the very intelligent insight of saying, and we wonder why our products are made with ever increasingly cheap materials and cheap foreign labor, all while our financial system takes on exponential debt and inflation to keep itself running. And I think this is a point illustrated by Chesterton and then elaborated on by Casius, is very important. Where exactly is the capitalist getting his money? Right, he's getting it from the people that he's trying to screw over. Right, you're trying to screw over your own workers to make as much profit as possible. Well, that profit has to come from customers, and those customers are going to be your own laborers, right? And it's a little bit more complex than that. When obviously you're not only getting profit, you're not only getting revenue from your own employees, right? You have employees of other businesses, but as every single industry becomes more interconnected and more monopolistic, right? The chain throughout the entire economy is going to be this singular effect, right? You're going to concentrate all of that wealth at the top while the people at the bottom struggle. And I think um, when communists talk about this, they don't really do a good job of explaining why this happens, right? They complain about the 1%, but they don't really uh, illustrate why this is happening. Well, this is just one paragraph, and I think it perfectly illustrates why this is happening, right? It's just common sense. Well, common sense in a contradictory way, right? Uh, because you obviously don't want this to happen, but the employer is just doing what he uh, is expected to do, right? He's trying to make the best profit margins, which means paying the least and charging the most, right? But who are you charging? The same people that you're paying. So, with that basic principle in mind, the wealth is going to become more and more concentrated, right? And because of that, that's an unsustainable system, right? Eventually, that's going to lead to the worker having no money and therefore not being able to spend money on any goods. So therefore, you need to keep exporting labor and importing shittier products, right? And that's the only way you can continue to have the same profit margins that you had at a given time. And that's why some people say capitalism is endlessly, it's predicated on endless growth, right? Which is one of the main problems of capitalism. Um, and then I had a few other notes that I found that I wanted to bring up. Quite a few uh, spots actually. So let's go to the first one. Was the parable. He had this very funny parable about a man who goes to the bar and starts drinking a beer, and then immediately tastes it's just the worst beer he's ever tasted. It tastes absolutely disgusting, and he uh, spits it all up, and then goes to a doctor, and the doctor says, "Well, sir, your beer was poisoned." And he's like, "Okay, the beer was poisoned. What are we going to do about it?" And the doctor says, "Well, we can't remove the poison until we have a good idea of what we're going to replace the poison with." um, which is quite humorous, right? But this is the exact arguments made by staunch capitalists, right? You say, "Oh, well, you're pointing out all these issues with capitalism, and you are uh, refusing. Well, I wouldn't say refusing. You can't articulate what you're going to replace capitalism with. Therefore, we need to keep this capitalist system," which is wrong, right? You can see that we're headed towards a spiral of very, very bad consequences. You don't need to have a perfectly articulated solution. What you need to do is remove the poison, right? So it's obviously illogical that the doctor would say, "We can't remove the poison until we have a replacement." No, you need to remove the poison immediately, and then you can worry about whether the replacement is actually worse than the poison, right? Because either way, you're gonna die. And so I think that's once again, these kinds of analogies, parables, they're really good ways of illustrating idea to a person who may not normally be so receptive, right? It's almost like Aesop or something like that, or even the Bible, right? The Bible is it has plenty of parables inside of it, and I think you can tell he's using that as an influence. So moving on, this was also in chapter 1. He talked about so this is a pretty interesting. So the context is he's talking about construction of a social scheme, right? You need to have some kind of economic ideology, whether that's capitalism, socialism, or in his case, distributism. But that you kind of fall into this rut of thinking you need a pure ideology when that's not how things work in reality. And so this is just one sentence that I really liked. He says, "We do not say that there is something what we do say that there is something which is much more real and much more reliable than any social scheme, and that is a society." So this might seem somewhat trite, but he's basically saying if you have a cohesive society and people that are looking out for each other, caring about each other, then you don't need this pure ideology, right? What is pure capitalism, socialism, all of that is very secondary to the quality of the people in your society, the quality of the people and their relationships and how they view each other. which I think is actually goes back to something that I've brought up several times throughout these episodes, which is what Evola said about, uh, you'd rather have a society made of very good, strong men in an imperfect system than the perfect system composed of weak and uh, morally bad men, right? So the makeup of your society is so much more important than the actual scheme, and that's just something that Chesterton is touching on here, right? If we stop worrying about pure ideology and start worrying about people, then suddenly, this question of, oh, how are we supposed to replace capitalism? It becomes much more easy to answer, right? Well, the thing is, we don't need some purely ideological way of looking at things. We just look at people as people. We look at a society as a society, right? It needs to be cohesive. um, and so the next note I had. Oh my gosh, I'm on Kindle, and I swear this thing is very hard to operate. All right, the next part was in chapter 2, and oh, this is a great section. So he opens with talking about criticisms of the big shops, right? So when he says big shops, I guess that would be our equivalent to when we say multinational megacorps, so the Walmart versus the ma and pa shop. So he says the big shops versus the small shops. So he says he wrote 2 articles, or said there were only 2 times in his career where he was censured, right? He tried to write an article and the editor said, no, I can't publish this. And so he says, on both those occasions, he denied me liberty of expression because I said that the widely advertised stores and their large shops were really worse than little shops. That, it may be interesting to note, is one of the things that a man is now forbidden to say. Perhaps the only thing he is nearly forbidden to say. If it had been an attack on the government, it would have been tolerated. If it had been an attack on God, it would have been respectfully and tactfully applauded. If I had been abusing marriage or patriotism or public decency, I should have been heralded in headlines and allowed to sprawl across Sunday newspapers. And ain't this the truth, right? Well, except maybe the criticism of government part. But if you attack any type of the things that really hold society together, these traditionalist values, public decency, marriage, and God, you will always have a platform. And this is Chesterton writing. Actually, I don't even know when he was writing. I would say mid 1900s, right? And it was the exact same situation. You will always have a platform to disparage traditional values, but you cannot have a platform to criticize big business. So, what is actually holding the society together? Going back to the last point, it is certainly not big businesses. It is, God, marriage, tradition, the family, public decency, all these things he talks about. So I guess it kind of shows the desperation of the situation when you can openly speak out against these things that are very beneficial to us, and you can't speak out against the things that are actively hurting us, right? Big business is obviously doing a lot of damage, and we'll get into that in a second. So I like that point, and then moving on to the next point in chapter 2. Where we go? Oh, okay. So now he's talking about the number of things that you could do. This is actually just a humorous part of the book. He talks about the number of things that you could do before getting totally desperate and basically giving up in a capitalist society. And so he lists a whole bunch of things. He says he could read a book. He could even write a book. He could let out all of these thoughts. And then he says, I could do a great many of things before I came to definitely antisocial action, like robbing a bank, or worse still, working in a bank. So I thought that was a very humorous point. He's saying that it's worse to work for a bank than to rob a bank. And I'm almost at the point where I agree in a totally unironic sense. So obviously this man is a Catholic. He's very anti-usury. And so, what exactly is society losing out on when you rob the bank? Right? They're just going to get bailed out. I mean, you're helping out yourself, and you're attacking a usurer, right? So, um, perhaps robbing a bank is a lot more morally sound than working at a bank. So that's just a humorous point, but I think it actually, is something to think about. If you actually have a pure moral value system, why is it more moral to work at a bank than to rob a bank? I mean, obviously, we have a law code that says which one is better, but the laws are not our morals, right? Our morals come from our values, they come from God. And I think uh, God might be able to justify robbing of a bank. I don't know if he could ever justify you working at a bank. So, something to consider. Um, then, lastly, uh, um, oh, okay, wait, one more. So, I have two more points. So, this one, the context was talking about, well, I'm just going to read it. So he says, in other words, we are told that the conspirators are too conspiratorial to be caught. Now, it is exactly at this point that my simple and childlike confidence in the business expert entirely breaks down. My attitude, a moment ago trustful and confiding, becomes disrespectful and frivolous. I am willing to agree that I do not know much about the details of business, but not that nobody could possibly ever come to know anything about them. So this is where he goes on a very this is the culmination of a very long rant on uh, trusts, right? Trusts as monopolies. Um, so he's saying, uh, and I know Casey has had another quote that was quite long that also was in reference to this. Um, but you go through this cycle of people thinking capitalism was so great by saying, in a true free market, trusts cannot exist, right? You won't have these trusts. There won't be monopolies, and that's what makes capitalism so great. And if you challenge capitalism on the fact that trusts might exist, then you're being dishonest, right? It's impossible. It's not going to happen. Well, now, a few decades later, well, not literally now, in Chesterton's time, you uh, now see that there are plenty of trusts, right? And trusts are bad, and now the argument has totally shifted from there can never be trusts to there can never not be trusts, right? So they're saying, oh well, no matter what you do, somebody's going to be on top, and there's nothing we can do about it. That's just how the free market works. And since we love the free market, we need to deal with trusts, right? It's just a par for the course. And you do hear these exact same arguments today, right? When people talk about um, breaking up Google or Apple, it's just either they're saying, "Oh, well, you're anti-free market," or they say, "Oh, well, if it wasn't them, it would be somebody else doing the monopolization." So it's going to happen either way. So you really have these extremely back and forth arguments, right? They first deny that trust could exist, and then they deny that trust cannot exist. Um, so this is just him calling that out, right? He's saying the second that you are going to flip your opinion like this, you are completely losing my faith, right? He's saying you will not trust any businessman who is going to blindly be devoted to this state of capitalism. And I think that this is something that people have to be very direct about, right? And he's being direct about it. If somebody is going to be dishonest and change their uh, opinion regarding capitalism in such a way, you have to call that out and you have to say, no, you're being a bullshitter. Uh, you need to you need to be realistic, and you need to see the problems within this system. And so, once again, this is just a capitalist critique. And then from there, he talks more about uh, not literal like white collar crime, but how how big businesses do monopolize and exploit people, which can sometimes be literally illegal, but then other times is um, legal but morally reprehensible. So he says normally a murder is committed, and uh, so he does the example of a man doesn't just find another man on the subway, slit his throat, and then go over to the police and say, "Hey, I found this body, and by the way, I killed them." Right? No, nobody does that. Even your most uh, prolific serial killer does not literally turn themselves in such a way. Whereas the way that capitalism functions, that's how we expect these businesses to handle themselves. To be like, oh, um, by the way, I've been cooking the books. Oh, by the way, I've been exploiting my workers. Oh, by the way, I've been importing illegal labor and undercutting all of their pay. That's not going to happen. So the police need to, well, not like the literal police, but the law enforcement agencies, whether federal or state, they need to actually investigate these kinds of crimes and take it just as seriously as a real crime, right? Yeah. So this is a really great quote. Um, we seem to be very inept, right, at uh, going after white collar crime and things like that, and he captures this ineptitude by saying, "But they cannot keep watch on a man that everybody has heard of to see whether he communicates with another man that everybody has heard of in order to do something that nearly everybody knows he is trying to do all his life." Right? So, let's think of somebody like Jeff Bezos, right? His literal job is to try and make as much money as possible, right? So he's going to be doing shady things like preventing unionization, uh, you know, hiring illegal labor, paying people below minimum wage, all of these things that he's going to be doing, and you can just assume because that's basically his job title. His job title is make as much money as possible, and he's going to be communicating with other people who are public figures that are totally not above being investigated, right? So there's absolutely zero reason why somebody as public as Bezos should be able to get away with any level of white collar crime. And this is just Chesterton explaining the ridiculousness in thinking that the police could possibly be so inept as to not be able to do this. It is not ineptitude; it is lack of trying, right, for various reasons. All right, so I think a lot of things that I had to say about general parts in the book, and I guess I gave a general overview. So I'll see what you guys have to say. So I see a comment here from Jerome. I think that the idea of being a student of people rather than systems of government is a particularly profound idea, in the sense that it is much easier to deal with people as units within society rather than the people that they actually are. The former requires a lot more intellectual work. Um, yeah, so very much so. And I think this is how we give rise to things like identity politics. It is so much easier to view uh, minorities as a monolith, to view women as a monolith, to view gay people as a monolith. Um, but ahead of that, that's not me to say that identity politics is bullshit or not relevant. I think it's the fact that in a true cohesive society, you don't need to worry about identity politics, right? If you had a cohesive society, and I don't know how much of this I'm allowed to get into, but say you had a society that only had a particular uh, race and demographic of people, I think it would be a lot more cohesive as a society because you wouldn't have to view people as a monolith. You could finally begin to start viewing people as individuals again. And I think that a lot of that individuality is actually lost as we diversify, right? You start to just see people as these large cultural units, and it makes everything work much less smoothly. Um, but yes, as far as the government goes, you totally need to bring back that uh, viewing people, viewing society as a collection of individuals, not a collection of demographics or a collection of classes, even, right? Um, and then you said, as such, it is likely truer in the sense that, yes, it's truer to view society as a collection of individuals than a collection of units. And then you said, because it accounts for the actual nature of people rather than as simple units. Yeah, so basically everything that we said. Um, all right. Well, if anybody else has any other comments, I would love to hear them. Otherwise, we could take to the phone lines. So I guess I'll hang out in voice and see what's going on there. But yeah. So far, I guess I like Chesterton. I think he's a good writer. I would like for the second half if he could really get into distributism though, because um, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of the people here are already pretty critical of capitalism. Um, so it's not a it's not exactly groundbreaking, the kind of things that he's saying. I like the way that he's presenting it, but it's not so much the actual material as the presentation. Because I think a lot of us are already, we know that there's problems with capitalism, but we also understand there's problems with communism. We're looking for some kind of in between kind of level. Uh, so, uh, yeah, I would love to see what his version of an in between is, as opposed to something like a fascism or a national socialism. I want to know what the actual particulars of distributism are. The thing that he keeps bringing up is private property and the defense of private property. I don't exactly know what that means, right? Because you could say capitalism defends private property, but I think he means it in the sense of uh, private property free from everything, right? Is your property really yours, and is it really private if it is subject to market concerns? If that makes sense, right? If you have uh, like a plot of land, and next week, because of some market crash, your plot of land is now worth nothing. Your private property has not actually been protected. And I think there was a section where he talked about this, but it wasn't totally clear. So I could be totally getting the idea of what it means to protect private property wrong. Uh, but yeah, like I said, I hope he really goes into that, because that will be something pretty fresh, I think, that we haven't ever really talked about uh, on this show or in this server at all. Well, it looks like nobody's hopping in on the voice chat, so I guess that's a good sign. I guess that means that I covered all the bases, or it means everybody's just busy. But this could be a short episode, and we'll get back and discuss the rest of it next week. Um, so yeah, I guess I'll wait another minute and then I'll sign off.